Welcome back to RSA Conference 2022. It's day 3. We're still recording live at the Marriott Marquis. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment is Joe Payne. He is President and CEO at Code42. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about insider risk management. Before we get into the details, what's the difference between insider risk management and insider threat? Because they sound very similar, don't they?
Yeah, it's the first question everybody always asks. And the term insider risk management, by the way, has been coined by Gartner in the last few months to define the whole category. We've been using it at Code42 for a couple of years because insider risk is more comprehensive than insider threat. And so when we're talking about insiders, first of all, most organizations don't want to think of their own employees as threats. And so it's a little bit of a kinder and gentler way. But it also encompasses the unintentional risk that employees often create when they move data where they're not supposed to use it. So as an example, sometimes employees do things like, hey, I used my personal email because I couldn't get into the corporate system and I needed to send this thing on a weekend and that's the only thing I had access to. Or I used my Dropbox account because I didn't know how to use our OneDrive account and I needed to share this with my team. And, you know, a lot of security teams would say, okay, is that a threat, from that senior manager, or was that just them putting our data at risk because they were trying to get their job done?
Right.
And so the risk really encompasses all the activity that an organization may see with regards to data, not just the ones that are malicious.
Got it. Because there's also been a lot of movement around human risk management, which plays into this a little bit. There are riskier employees in an organization. And when you understand behaviors and you understand where that risky population is, then you can do things like training and create policies and other things around that risky population. And, and I imagine there's a correlation between insider risk and this kind of human risk element that actually allow you to make changes to policies so that you reduce that overall risk.
Well, you've identified something that's a super important part of insider risk, which is the education component. This is one of those areas in security where you really need to take a comprehensive program view towards your employees. And just in the same way the spam market really relies on educating employees what not to click on and how to handle spam. In this market, you'd be surprised how little employees know about what they're allowed to do with their data. So many software developers think, for example, when they leave a job, they can take all their source code with them. They wrote it. They're leaving a copy behind the company's using, but they wrote their source code, so it's their source code, so they can take it. So they have to be educated that, no, you can't do that. Salespeople often take their pipeline from Salesforce.com. They're not allowed to do that. So the education component is super important. And sometimes the education component is as simple as, okay, you shared that document in OneDrive and you publicly shared it. You should have privately shared it, and the security team can course correct that using education components that at Code42 we've actually started offering the market because it's such an important part of what we do.
Exactly right. Yeah, and the training is an important component, right? And I see the human risk management component coming out of the security awareness and training for that reason, right? Because it's tied to the training programs and identifying risky. But the data here also plays into that risk calculation because it's actually looking at activity and what they're doing with data.
That's right.
That influences other human risk elements that would then also impact awareness and training.
Well, that's a big change that we've also brought to the market in terms of at Code42, we're looking for data that's moved to untrusted locations. And so we're looking for actual events that happen. Hey, someone moved something to Dropbox. Someone put something on using AirDrop on a personal device. Someone emailed themselves a document because they wanted to keep it. And by the way, that's the number one way people take data today is they upload it via browser to their Gmail while they're sitting off the network, and they mail it to themselves, and then they have it forever. So that kind of kind of activity happens all the time, and it's a huge part of the equation. Now, when you think about what a UEBA does, in a UEBA looks for risky activity, risky human behavior, and then says, did something happen? Are those people threats? Are they risks? We've turned that on its head and said, no, let's look for actual exfiltration. And then let's paint things against those events that we know about those people. So, for example, if Matt moves something to Dropbox, well, is Matt a departing employee? Does Matt have privileged access? Has Matt ever used Dropbox before?
Right.
These are all things that help determine whether that's a really risky activity or just a slightly risky activity. If you're leaving the company and you move something to Dropbox and it's the first time you've ever used Dropbox, that's something I'm going to want to investigate.
Right.
If you're a longtime employee that uses Dropbox and we've seen it before and, we don't have any other indications, then maybe that's a low risk activity, and maybe we just send you an email with a video showing you how you use OneDrive instead of Dropbox.
Right.
So again, that human element is really important, but it's in the context and insider risk management of an event that actually happened, and that's important for security people because the UEBAs of the world have created so many false positives and so much noise that we only want to bring these things up when someone has actually done something.
Right. Yeah, you want that evidence that something happened, because otherwise you have the SOC analyst chasing around a bunch of alerts that may or may not be malicious, may be completely normal. So how does the technology work? Is it because I've seen some different data security products out there, because the challenge here is once it's out, is it out forever? Can you get it back? So talk to me about how you monitor and track the data. Can you get it back? Can you deny access to the data once it leaves? Like, how does this actually work?
So that brings up a really good point about like what we're trying to achieve and why IRM is so different than DLP. And in the DLP world, and I would describe that as a bit of a fantasy world, what you're trying to do is make sure you keep everything in and that you lock everything down and you keep people from sharing data. But in today's business world, most CIOs have deployed digitization strategies and collaboration strategies. We've put out Slack and Teams and Zoom and OneDrive and Box and Salesforce and Snowflake, and we've put all these cloud applications and all this collaboration technology. We want people to share data.
Right.
We want them to collaborate. We want them to be, I've got something I want to share with finance or HR or legal, and I want to do this collaboration. And that's where the DLP systems have really failed. They were written 20 years ago. They were written pre-cloud, and they were written with collaboration not being the focus of an organization.
Right.
And so what we have come in with IRM, it's us, it's Microsoft, it's a few other smaller players, have come in and said, look, we want to enable collaboration. We want everyone to share data freely with trusted locations. And then we want to say, if something goes outside a trusted location, let's score it, let's flag it, and let's determine if we need to do an investigation. And then we've made it really easy to do an investigation like in seconds, so that you can solve the situation when it happens. And so one way to think about this is in the course of a day, we might have 200,000-300,000 successful shares. And then we might have a few exfiltrations that we need to deal with. A DLP would say, block all those shares, block all that collaboration, because we don't want those 2 or 3 things to happen.
Right.
And in the course of that, they make the whole company frustrated, angry, inefficient, and what the company does is they just go around those controls. They find a different way to do it.
Right.
And so those controls are meaningless in the first place. So coming full circle to your question, no, we let data flow freely. And then what we do is by catching it right when it happens, it's really easy to get that data back and easy to create consequences for the individual if they take it.
Right.
So let me give you a really specific example. We have a customer who recently is in a trial for our product, and they had a financial services organization, and they saw a software developer taking source code in their last week on the job. Now, they came back to us and said that was $5 million of source code.
Wow.
that individual took. And by catching the individual, they sit down and they have the conversation. Why are you doing this? What's going on? To explain. Maybe there's a real business reason behind it. There wasn't. The person was leaving. They thought they were allowed to take their source code. the company said, okay, you're going to return that source code. We're going to look at your device, make sure that we have it all back. And if we're not satisfied with your responses, we'll be notifying your next employer that you may have that source code, and then now they're on the hook. In the course of explaining that to the employee, the hands start shaking. You're going to tell my next employer that I stole source code from you. So they do everything they can to return that source code to make sure they don't have any copies and make you satisfied, because nobody wants their next employer informed that they remove data from their current employer, because that's too risky for you to bring a new person in.
Right.
So what I described to you, we see constantly within our customer base, and that particular example is, CrowdStrike's one of our best customers at Code 42, and Tim Briggs is the head of insider risk over at CrowdStrike, and he says to me, Joe, whenever we have that conversation, we get that data back.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So, but in the meantime, what's really important to understand is, in the meantime, they enable collaboration throughout their whole organization, as opposed to being security teams that just get in the way of everybody doing their job.
Yeah. Remove the friction, allow business to happen freely and openly, look for the outliers, investigate and respond appropriately. So instead of trying to do true data loss prevention, which is impossible, really, unless you lock down everything, then you, from a business perspective, really can't function. It's really about detecting where those risks are and then going out and doing the forensics and the investigation to go get that data back, which is a different model than most of the data security players.
It's really interesting because, and it also recognizes that you treat insiders differently than you treat outsiders. Because when a piece of malware comes into your organization, your response as a security organization is, we're not worried about intent. We're going to whack it. We're going to isolate it. We're going to shut it down. And speed is really important because we don't want it to propagate. Insider risk doesn't propagate. And so the speed with which you respond can be in hours and days. It doesn't have to be in minutes and seconds. So you can get to intent. You can understand the context. You can, we call it empathetic investigations, a term that most security people laugh at because they're like, empathetic. And that's not my job. It's like, actually, in an insider environment, it is your job.
Yeah.
If you're going to interview the CFO of the company, this is another thing that happened 2 weeks ago. CFO publicly shared a document called Restructuring Plan, one of our customers. Do you think the CFO meant to do that? No. That's an example of unintentional insider risk, but how you handle that as a security person is very different than how you would handle if there was a piece of malware on that machine.
Right.
So it is a different problem. It is in a part of the organization that the security team needs to really rethink and relearn how it responds in this environment.
Yeah. Key use cases seem to be things like source code protection, obviously intellectual property protections, and other sensitive documents are like key use cases of why people would deploy this kind of technology, right?
Well, it's one of those spaces where people are like, oh, do I just need to protect my executive team? That's the first, they often ask that. And then it's like, no. Listen, everyone in your company has critical information that you wouldn't want at your competitors. So source code is the thing we see growing the most today. Software developers moving their source code from one to the other. The old UEBA thing was, if we see a salesperson with source code, then we want to create an alert. It's like, what is a salesperson going to do with source code? They don't even know what it is. They don't know what it looks like.
Right.
What you're really worried about is the person that wrote that source code taking that source code with them.
Right.
And because they know how it works, they know what to do, and they can use it. So source code exfiltration, salespeople have a tendency to take their data out of Salesforce.com.
Yep.
Yeah. So we've actually at Code 42, we've built an integration with Salesforce cloud to cloud, and then we correlate that with what we see on the endpoint. And so if a salesperson downloads a file from Salesforce but doesn't put it on their trusted device, say they download it to their untrusted device, then we will see that. We're the only player in the industry that can see that and then create an alert on that. That's been hugely valuable for organizations. In my own company, while we were alpha in that product, just burning that product in, I caught one of our own employees moving data who was departing our company, going to another company in the security industry, taking data out of Salesforce, putting it on a personal device. And we ended up firing that employee. We got that data back. We actually put the new company on notice so they couldn't use that data.
Right.
So, we see this even in our own company. We see this kind of thing. So The other thing I want to share is kind of one people don't think of is it used to be we thought of recruiters as sort of the lowest people on the totem pole in an organization. But there's a pretty famous case out there right now with Tesla where one of their competitors hired away the Tesla recruiters. The Tesla recruiters had all of the comp information for their own, for the Tesla jobs.
Oh, wow.
And the concept was, hey, if we hire the recruiters away and they bring all that comp information of who makes what, then we can cherry pick some of their best people.
Oh, wow.
You know, now in that scenario, Tesla is not a customer of Code 42. In that scenario, it was a failure of their security team because they didn't discover it when it happened. They discovered it a year later, and now they're in a lawsuit and dealing with all that kind of stuff. But I bring that one up because what you see there is that everyone in your organization has data that you would not want to have leave the organization,
Right.
and in particular when they're departing.
Yeah.
So that's really when we see the biggest thing. We also see a lot of problematic things happen when people join an organization. Because if everyone's taking data when they leave, and about 60% of people admit that they took data from their last job, where are they taking it to? They're
Their
bringing
next
it
one.
into your organization.
Right.
And that puts a lot of risk on your organization if you hire somebody new and they bring a bunch of data from one of your competitors.
Right.
So we also protect against that.
Great use cases. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me.
If anybody wants to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/code42. Stay tuned. We have more interviews coming up.